What's the worst I hate to break it to you moment you had with someone? Story 1. I used to work in a customer care call center for a major telecommunications company. A woman called in one day to inquire about $299 charges on her bill from Lava Life. She kept pressing about the charges, what they were, and I had to explain to her that Lava Life is a dating service and that the charges were legitimate. If she didn't make them, did someone else live in her house who might have? There was only her husband, and I heard her go from, "but he would never," to "I have to go now," as it set in. That was almost 20 years ago now, and I still feel awful about it. Story 2. I had a guy working for me that was extremely nice, easy to get along with, and wildly inept. Not even like low effort, but just not capable of learning seemingly basic tasks. We tried everything. Coaching, giving him legitimate checklist instructions, having a team lead sit with him for a couple weeks to walk him through basics, everything. Everyone said the same thing. He just couldn't do the job. Everything he did had to be double-checked by somebody else, which meant that we might as well have somebody else do it. But everyone liked the guy. They thought he was easygoing and cool to be around. Everything. But still, he just straight up couldn't do that job. So I had to find another place for him in the company that would better match his skills. The option would be for him to either take the lower job with lower pay, or he would be fired with severance. I was not looking forward to the conversation. I called him in for a one to break it to him, and the first thing he started with was, "Hey boss, before we start, I just want to tell you that I really feel like I've been doing a great job here, and I would like to talk about a raise." Yeah, that conversation was not a fun one. Story 3. There was a rule at my job where only one of these two supervisors could be off at a time. One of them loved to take a full week off work during holidays to get more bang for his PTO buck. One year he had Thanksgiving week off, but the other supervisor had family come to town that week on late notice. The other supervisor asked him to cancel just one of his days so she could spend the day with family. He declined, even after she basically begged him, and he even said he didn't have anything to do that day. She then proceeded to take PTO days every Wednesday of a holiday week for the next calendar year, effectively blocking him from taking his cheap weeks off. He told me that he thought it was funny because he knew she didn't have enough time to take all those vacation days off, and she'd eventually have to cancel some of them. I got to tell him, "I hate to break it to you, but she only took 2 hours off each of those days." See, the rule didn't differentiate between a partial or whole day, so she only had to burn 24 or so hours to block him. He looked devastated. It was kind of petty on both of their parts, but I give her credit for being creative in her retribution, and don't blame her a bit for what she did. Story 4. Had a friend ask me about some green sign in the distance. It was in fact a sodium vapor sign giving off an intense orange light, which sodium vapor is known for. Had to tell him right there that he was colorblind. He was in his mid-30s too. A lot of odd things that had happened in his past fell into place for him that day. Story 5. I had to tell my friend that the online girlfriend he'd been talking to for months was actually a scammer using stolen photos. He was planning to send her money to come visit, and breaking the news to him was one of the toughest conversations I've ever had. Story 6. Having to tell a student who was almost totally blind that she likely couldn't be an ER nurse. She and her dad moved to our district, and at the IEP, her dad starts talking about how he can't wait for Sue to go to nursing school. I frantically scanned my brain, trying to think of how someone who was going to need Braille would be able to do that job. Then Sue piped up to say that her dream was to be an ER nurse. Her prior district told her she could do anything, including this. She had a degenerative disease that would eventually make her blind. I talked to my friends who are nurses. I talked to our career lady at the school. I researched, but there just wasn't any way someone who couldn't see could be an ER nurse. I reconvened the IEP and had to explain this. I know both were in denial, but I was not happy that the prior district pumped up this idea. I mean, sure, there is lots she could still do, but that just wasn't one of them. Then another student came from the same district with the idea she could be a CSI investigator. She was also nearly blind. Story 7. Not me, but I went to visit my dad at his job, and he has an employee there who was kind of bragging to his other coworkers about how well he has been doing at the job and thinking of asking for promotion. My dad later told me that he fired that guy later that day due to poor performance despite multiple attempts to help him, LOL. Story 8. My best friend in high school was overweight and would sweat profusely. We would come in after lunch in Texas and he would smell awful. I think he would wear his clothes without washing them after sweating. We had English after and the AC sucked, so teacher put a fan in the window. He would sit in front of the fan and blow his funk over everyone. The class got together and voted that I should be the one to tell him. Well, I had to break it to him that for the last year he has smelled horribly. I felt pretty bad, but he never stunk again. Story 9. Oof. Definitely the time I had to tell a friend that the business opportunity he was so excited about was actually a pyramid scheme. He was so hyped, talking about how he was going to quit his job and be his own boss. I tried to ease into it, but there's really no soft way to say, hey man, you're about to lose a lot of money and ruin your friendships. Story 10. My sister-in-law. My niece plays field hockey and I love her. She plays in 2 different leagues, meaning it's 3 hours of field hockey games every Saturday and Sunday. My sil expected me and my husband to drive an hour one way both days to watch niece play and pay rapt attention the whole time. Did I mention the games are at 7 a.m.? We did this about once a month on either Saturday or Sunday, and I guess this wasn't enough for her. We had to tell her that we loved niece, but we weren't going to be as involved as she was in the league. Story 11. Freshman year of college, a friend said that he was going to go barefoot as much as possible to toughen up his feet so that his future kids would be born with tough feet too. Had to explain to him why that wouldn't work and the basics of genetics. He didn't believe me and stuck with his theory. We have since lost touch, but I know he had a son a few years ago. I'll have to ask him if it worked out. Story 12. I have 2. The first one was having to tell my father and my brother's girlfriend that my brother had been in a bad automobile accident, that my cousin who had been with him was dead, and my brother was in a coma in a hospital 3 hours away. The second one was when I had to tell my mother that my sister was sleeping with my mother's boyfriend. That was a tough one. And yes, I was 100% sure because they did it in front of me. Story 13. Not me, but my ex. A couple years ago got a job as a cook working at a big hospital. They had a mostly set and reoccurring cycle of dishes/items in Golden Corral-style stations around the cafeteria. Basic bitch food dressed up or pre-prepped. Nothing too fancy. His first month, he became familiar with some of the residents/doctors who would make small talk and shoot the with him as he loaded up their plates. One of these doctors was a man originally from India who was very enthusiastic about the country fried chicken smothered in pepper gravy. He said it was his favorite dish out of anything else there, and it wasn't uncommon for him to stop by at the end of his shift to purchase extra to take home. My partner's first time working the entree station, the doctor pointed and asked my partner for his usual country fried chicken. My partner stared at him confused. They didn't serve country fried chicken, but they do have chicken fried steak. When he nonchalantly informed the doctor of this, the man's eyes went wide. He looked genuinely shocked. "This isn't chicken?" My partner described the expression on his face as going from jarred and baffled to so sad when he realized he had been eating beef this entire time, but also that it had tasted so delicious. Apparently, despite eating other types of meat, the man was still deeply tied to his Hindu roots and avoided beef in his regular diet because of this. The previous cook before him had mistaken these ambiguous meat patties smothered in thick gravy for chicken, so wires got crossed, and he then relayed that incorrect information to the doctor. I still cringe when I think about this. X felt so sad he had to be the one to tell him. Story 14. I was crossing the road at Great Portland Street when I heard a screeching of brakes. I turned around to see a dude flying through the air. It all happened in slow motion. I got to him quickly and checked him over. He said, "I'm going skiing tomorrow." I said, "No, you're not," as I found the bottom half of his leg was snapped clean in half. Had to phone his wife and break the news. Story 15. I was a 15-year-old freshman, and she was 17-year-old senior. When we started dating, she said she wanted to wait 2 months before having. I was a virgin and wasn't even really worried about it, so I agreed. Then a month later, things got hot and heavy, and she insisted that we do it. I asked, "Are you sure? You said you wanted to wait," but she insisted on banging it out anyways. Afterwards, she said that it was a test to see if I would actually wait like I said I would, and that I failed just like every other guy before me did. Then she dumped me. Story 16. I hate to break it to you, but the hardest moment was telling my best friend that their partner was cheating. They were so in love and completely blinded by it, and when I broke the news, it shattered their world. It even strained our friendship for a while because sometimes, even when you're trying to help, the truth is too painful to accept. Story 17. I had an employee who was a strict vegetarian for religious reasons. One day we were discussing the employee salad bar, and he mentioned how much he loved the Caesar dressing packets they offered. I was surprised and stupidly blurted out, "Oh, I didn't realize you ate fish." He responded that he was vegetarian and gave me a quizzical look. I had to explain that the salad dressing contained both fish and Parmesan cheese, which is almost always cultured with animal rennet. He didn't believe me and, the next day, insisted on reading the ingredients on one of the packets to me to prove to me that I was wrong. Then he got to the anchovies and got quiet. I still feel awful that he had to find out that way. Neither of us handled the situation well. Story 18. Back around 2007, I had an older colleague who was excitedly flitting around the office, telling everyone about some lottery she had won. and that she was going to quit just as soon as the 100,000 cleared in her account. Mary was only in her 50s, so still years away from retirement. On top of that, she was an administrative assistant at a nonprofit, so we're not talking about a lucrative career where she was squirreling away funds for a rainy day. And here she was, ready to resign a decade early over a sum that would only be worth a few years of salary after taxes. Did I mention that there was talk of a fur coat? I would have normally kept my mouth shut. After all, her poor financial planning was none of my business. And frankly, I would not have missed her in the office. I was not a fan. I just couldn't be silent once she got to my office, though. It was obviously a scam. I'm not trying to rain on your parade, but are you absolutely sure this is legit? Oh yeah, I already gave them my banking information and everything. They're depositing the money today. You may want to call your bank just to be sure. No, it's fine. Okay, congrats. Per S. Dear reader, not even an hour later I hear her screeching into her phone that, no, don't close my account. They're supposed to be depositing the money. Depositing. No, depositing. No, they're not taking it out. They're putting it in. My office mate and I just looked at each other like, Mary didn't say anything to anyone about the fraud. ETA. The bank calling her as a security measure saved her from getting cleaned out. The scammers didn't actually get her money. Epilogue. About a year later, a bunch of us, Mary and myself included, were laid off at the beginning of the recession. I didn't like Mary, but I didn't wish her unwell. I can only imagine how much harder it was for her to find work than us, 20 and 30-somethings who lost our jobs. I know the people laid off were cherry-picked based on who the founder didn't like. Question a process? List. Do anything other than cheerlead the founder's ideas? List. Run around the office talking about quitting? Mary absolutely landed on the list that day. She had been one of the first employees the org ever hired, and just like that, she was disposable. Story 19. I was traveling for work in Australia. Let's say I was commuting between Perth and Sydney and back again. The back again flight was at stupid o'clock, requiring me to get up at 3 a.m. to leave at 4 a.m. to be at the airport by 5 a.m. I was groggy and moving on autopilot. I stopped to buy a coffee at an airport kiosk and the barista asked me, "Where are you flying to today?" I sleepily replied to Sydney, and the guy looked stunned. He said, "I hate to break it to you, but you are in Sydney." Story 20. I had been working on a project for about 10 months. It was finally done. I got to present it to my department's leadership. They loved it. I did a great job. They wanted to flow it up. I ended up presenting to the president of the company, a highlight in my early career for sure. I went and did the presentation. All 5 people in the chain of command between me and the president were there, along with a lot of the other senior leadership in the company. The president seemed pleased with the presentation. I thought it was great. We were apparently the last thing in the meeting, so everyone was dismissed. Then he asked me, my boss's boss, and our senior director to stay behind. He told us we did some great work on this, but to not continue any work, there was going to be a strategic shift and this project would not be finished. Kind of stung, almost a year of my labor, a total waste. Maybe unsurprisingly, about a month later there were layoffs. I took the buyout. I wasn't feeling super secure in my position anymore. Story 21. I was at a tech entrepreneurial meetup back in 2012. I spoke with one guy who was enthusiastically describing his billion-dollar idea, an app that people at the gym could use to track their workouts and do challenges. He said there was even a social media potential because people could share their progress. You mean like Strava? I asked, thinking he had perhaps identified a niche market not covered by Strava and Demondo and others. I got a confused what in response. He'd never heard of it. The look on his face when I showed him the app and he saw that his idea had been thoroughly realized for some time was tragic. How he had gotten as far with his idea as he had without finding any existing apps is a mystery to me. Story 22. I lived with the roommates and we got a new sublet of some guy they all knew. The guy's girlfriend of 5 years wanted to take a break. Everybody in the house said she had clearly wanted to dump him for a while. The guy moved in and I become friends with him. He definitely thought they were getting back together, but he got depressed and drank a lot. One night, he tells the housemates and I that he cheated on her a few times and even slept with his ex-GF on and off the first year they dated. Yikes. She, his new ex, was an absolute bombshell. Could have easily been a model. The kind of face you could just stare at. Unreal looking. But she was a total little Miss Princess. Real self-centered type, but a lot of fun to party with. She still hung around with the overall group of friends and my roommates. One night, everybody was drinking together when her ex wasn't around. Somebody brought up cheating and she started laughing. Someone was curious why she found it funny. It's just not something I have to worry about. I'm too attractive. Nobody would cheat on me. Story 23. I was the one being braked to. In university, I was with a group of classmates and briefly ranted about how annoying it was when people recorded and posted countless, seemingly infinitely long video clips of concerts they attended. Awkward silence. Then two of the people there jokingly said they felt a bit personally attacked, chuckled, and said something like, "I want my friends to be able to see many different parts of the concerts. But I don't regret anything. Stand for what I said and weren't close to anyone there." Story 24. I'd like for things to go back to the way they were before I found you. I found my bio dad a year and a half ago. Always knew he was out there and wanted to run into him before it was too late. I deeply, deeply regret it. Never felt like he was interested in me. Only wanted to talk about himself, his girlfriend, places he had been, the restaurant he went to last week, complaining about his job. He's the kind of guy who could deliver a monologue for an hour and still keep going. I gave it a year, and I just couldn't take it any longer. I think what sealed it for me is realizing that he never asked about my birthday, even though I had known him for over a year and we made a big deal about meeting and doing something for him. Story 25. Telling a girl that was a friend of mine, that her new boyfriend, who was also a friend of mine, wasn't attracted to her until she would lose weight. And his goal is to get you to lose weight because he said he knows you'll be knockout then. She didn't believe me. A month later, she said she can't believe it's true and wished she would have believed me. He left her because he told her she wasn't losing weight. Story 26. A guy I was dating who told me from the start he didn't want to ever get married again because he had been divorced once already. I accepted that. I told him from the start that at some point that I would break up with him because eventually I would want to get married after I was finished my education and solid in my career. He was good with that. He proposed a little after a year. Story 27. I had a friend who was a musician, and we worked at a video store. He did it for health insurance, but otherwise he was successful to be able to earn a living wage through his craft. A guy from a group of friends ignored him one day on the job. For months he was wondering why. It would come up. He'd whine about it, and then it would be a while before he wondered again months later. The last time he wondered about why, I told him the truth from which I overheard. The friend thought he was a loser for working at the video store. I did it out of frustration because he was still bothered by it. He was absolutely heartbroken about it. None of us saw him for a week after that. We were all looking for him. Roommates found him dead in bed. Died of a heart attack, we believed, like his father. I wish I never told him. Story 28. A friend was really excited about a job opportunity. He'd been working hard for it and had all these dreams of what it would mean for his future. When he finally got the call, I had to be the one to break the news that the company had decided to go in a different direction. Seeing their face drop was heartbreaking. It felt so awkward, like I was the messenger of bad news in a moment they'd been looking forward to. Story 29. This was by accident, but one of the most uncomfortable moments I've ever experienced. I was dating a guy whose best friend, I'm going to call him Joe Blow, was engaged to a woman named Linda. One night, the guy I was dating was coming over to watch a movie and cook dinner and asked me if he could bring along Joe Blow, whose fiancée was out of town. His actual real name was more of an unusual name, not a really common name, both first and last names. The evening went along fine until I learned the last name of the girl he was engaged to, and I knew her from years before when she married to a guy named Joe Blow. Yep, same name. As they were leaving, I said to him, "It's so funny she's marrying you now, when her ex-husband's name is also Joe Blow. It's funny, ha ha ha. I mean, it was shocking to me." He looked surprised and I asked, "Oh, you didn't know that?" I was a little embarrassed. He said, "I didn't even know she had been married before." The guy had a PhD in psychology to boot. He looked to his friend as if he wanted some verification, and his friend said, Yeah, man. She was married to Joe Blow for about 5 years. They've been divorced about a year. It was a terribly awkward moment for all three of us, and I really wish I hadn't said anything, but WTH? Story 30. Someone had this conversation with me, and I wish to this day they never had. They told me my girlfriend's at the time's final moments were spent screaming my name and that she just wanted me there. I'll never understand why she felt the need to tell me. She was in the car with her during the accident and ended up in a coma for about a year. She told me this about 2 months after she came out of it. Weren't to where. My phone absolutely hates the word were for some reason. Story 31. TLDR, had to gently crush someone's dreams of dating my fiancé when I overheard her planning to ask him out after work. Story. My fiancé and I worked together, just in different parts of the company and building per hour requirements, though our respective teams cross paths frequently. Nobody but HR and 2 other people knows we're actually together, though, because we keep our personal and professional lives very separate. We don't even interact at work beyond carpooling there and back. This one lady on my team apparently developed a little crush on him, and he is clueless about when women are flirting with him. He's neurodivergent. So for a long time, he just thought she was being friendly. I didn't even catch on to it at first because I really don't pay much attention to what my coworkers do beyond work-related things. But I guess she kept finding reasons to go hang out around him when our team's work was done and chatting him up. He eventually caught on and expressed his concern that she was coming on to him to me in private and was unsure of what to do, so I said I'd handle it. It wasn't long before I heard her giggling to a group of other coworkers and saying stuff like, "Yeah, I think he's totally down. I'm going to go for it and ask him out after work." So I drifted over nonchalantly and was like, "Ooh, an office romance. Who's the guy?" And of course she told me it was my man. So I had to gently crush her dreams and say, oh, I'm so sorry, girl, but he's engaged. To me. I felt kind of bad because she looked so mortified and crestfallen at the same time. Story 32, not me, but I was there for it. After a family wedding, my dad and some of his cousins he hadn't seen in years were at my parents' home drinking beers and catching up. As they were laughing about an old story from being kids, my dad asked one of the cousins how his little brother is doing, because they hadn't talked in a few years. The room got so dead silent instantaneously that we could tell something was very off. The cousin he asked about with the brother got choked up, and another cousin awkwardly told my dad that the brother had died the year prior. Turns out my entire family was aware and had all gone to the memorial and been notified. My grandma somehow failed to realize nobody had informed my parents, so it was literally only my family that had no clue. Nobody even really shared about it on social media, so it was just a complete shock to us. Story 33. My mom and I, at best, tolerated each other my entire life. It got to the point that my dad was the messenger of communication between us. I went to see my dad for the holidays. During my visit, an argument broke out between my mom and I. She started screaming about how this was most probably the last Christmas we'd get to be a family because she and my dad were on the verge of divorce. I remember screaming, "I didn't visit for you. I visited in spite of you. I'm here for Dad." I will never forget her face. There's a lot of details like childhood abuse. So my relationship with my mother is not as simple as just not getting along. Story 34. My ex-friend of 18 years was messy AF at my 25th birthday brunch. She kept comparing the fallouts of our individual relationships with our exes, like who was treated worse, whose ex was worse overall, etc., to my other guest, who she doesn't even know. At that point, I knew the conversation was going to go downhill, but I was ready to clap back. My ex-friend is obsessed with her ex, even though he treated her so badly and did her wrong in some of the craziest ways. Despite all that, she loved talking about him. He is her whole personality, basically. Out of nowhere, she brought up that he talks about me to her, and I said, "That's funny because we don't even talk, and he should know nothing about me that's discussable to you unless you've told him my business, but also I'm sure he's been upset that I rejected him for the last 5 years. And that's why he's with you instead, still messaging me, trying to be with me." Story 35. I lost a fair chunk of my memory after an acquired brain injury. Every time I started talking about someone and my husband had to tell me that they had died. Hate to break it to you moments, especially tell me again, bringing me to tears over and over again. Story 36. My superior, a bank VP, told me to fire my subordinate because he's always snapping his fingers when he walks and he knows it drives everybody crazy. She said if I don't do it, she'll fire both of us. This was decades ago. Laws were mere suggestions then. I took him to lunch and let him pick the restaurant. After eating, as we were pushing our empty plates to the center of the table, I just blurted out, "Ken, you're fired." "Yeah, I know. Is it about the snapping thing?" "Yeah, you knew this was coming?" "Yeah, I told them my ankle pops for a few steps if I sit still for a while," he says. He gets up and walks around the table, and I can hear this loud pop, pop, pop. I told him, "I guess she doesn't believe you." He smiled and said it was okay. He'd already accepted an offer somewhere else, and he knew this was coming. A couple of years later, Ken's boss reached out and headhunted me, and Ken and I got to work together for a few years. Great guy, loud ankles. Story 37. My manager took a new opportunity, and the director made me acting manager for 7 months with no bump in pay. And they told me they had to interview other candidates, but I would probably have it. They gave the position to an outside candidate and told me I was expected to train him. I knew they had invited a guy in for a second interview, so I started looking for another job. I had an offer in hand when they explained that I did not have the job. Told him that I hated to break it to him, but I had another job and I was putting in my notice effective immediately. He was confused that I had been looking for another job and was not gullible enough to swallow his BS. Story 38. I'm a CPA CFP. I sat down with a friend's parents right before the pandemic about retirement. They had set up an IRA when they became a thing back in the 1970s and had been contributing to it regularly ever since. They didn't really understand this stuff, so they let their financial advisor handle the investments, but he had long since retired, so they wanted to sit down with me to go over their options. I looked at both their accounts and almost had a heart attack when I saw that all of their money in both IRAs were in money market accounts. They had been contributing to a retirement account all their working lives, but weren't actually investing the money. It wasn't growing with the market. It was certainly an oversight by their financial advisor, but they're self-directed accounts. It was their responsibility to manage them. Most people don't understand this. People assume the person who opened the IRA is sitting there monitoring their account, but they're not. Not unless it's a managed account that you're specifically paying a fee for that management. They did have Social Security and equity in their home, but without the investment money they were counting on, they just didn't have enough for the retirement they were originally planning on. I advised them both to continue working until they reached full retirement to maximize Social Security and minimize deductions from what they had, convert their basement into an apartment for the rental income, and consider a reverse mortgage. In the end, they did okay, but it was an extremely tough conversation to have with them. Story 39. We had this poster making at school, and one of my classmates asked me to help him make it. I was too kind back then, so I agreed, and I love poster making. Fast forward, it was the day where the posters were displayed, and I was with my friend. She recognized my handwriting and told me that my work was on display. I had this "I hate to break it you" moment in my mind, lol. Yeah, that poster was not mine. It was my classmate's, which I made for him. Story 40. My ex-wife kept saying she had this amazing pit bull divorce attorney, how this woman was going to take me to cleaners, etc., etc. I had a feeling she was full of it, so I made an appointment with that attorney. By going for a consultation, I conflicted her out and my ex couldn't use her. As our divorce progressed, my ex kept talking a huge game but didn't show up for anything. She ended up defaulting on divorce. When she found out, she went goofy and was yelling at me how she was getting this divorce attorney on phone, etc. I smiled and said, "When you do, reminder of my consultation with her." I explained, "You don't have an attorney. Never did, and it is what it is." I said, "You can't play a bluff card that doesn't exist." Made me feel amazing, and she's still bent over it. Story 41. I was at a big music festival having a drink with some kind babes. One of them mentioned how it's so thoughtful that all the porta potties have purse holders so you can get yourself organized. The guys looked at each other, and a quick thinking guy asked her to describe what the purse holders looked like, thinking that maybe as dudes we didn't notice them. She described the purse holder. All the other dudes just wide-eye, side-eyed each other until I had the courage to say, "I hate to be the one to break this to you, but you've been setting your purse down in a urinal for days." Story 42. Not the worst, but one that happened about 2 hours ago. I work somewhere after everybody else has left, so I'm locked in by the last person to leave. Only, when I tried to leave, I couldn't unlock the door. There are other doors, but not ones where I could set the alarm and still get out without setting it off. Messaged the group chat and got, I hate to break it to you, but we had the locks changed, and it seems that nobody thought to tell you. They didn't just forget to tell me. They also forgot about me and the whole process that goes with who needs a new key. Thankfully, they didn't forget about the person who's away on holiday, so I got the key they left for her. Story 43. Had a kid, 14, be placed with us through children's services due to a huge number of behaviors of concern, from a home full of domestic violence. Had a tantrum and was adamant that they didn't have to listen to us because we needed permission from their mother. Finding a way to gently disclose that their dad had literally left the country unannounced to live with his secret overseas family, we didn't tell them that bit, and their mother had completely given up custody and guardianship to children's services and had no interest in ever seeing them again was so rough. There is a happy-ish ending. They are now placed with a family and doing very well, and almost all behaviors of concern are resolved, but sadly still no contact with original family unit. Story 44. I worked at an institution of higher education in the U.S. I worked in records determining if students qualified for in-state residency. For non-U.S. Redditors, a student's residency will impact tuition costs for the student. Vast majority of the time, it was very obvious if a student qualified or not. Cue a student fresh out of a U.S. high school who had a B2 visa. I had the terrible duty of telling her that not only could I not grant in-state residency, but that she couldn't enroll at all due to her visa status. If she were to enroll without requesting a change in visa status, she could be deported and unable to return to the U.S. in the future. Did not enjoy having that conversation with them and their parent. Story 45. Had an employee of mine years ago that was convinced he was going to get a sweet overseas position working in Europe with our company. He was absolutely convinced that he was going to get the job even though he hadn't actually yet applied for it yet. He was on the internet looking at possible places to live in the city where this position was located when I had to break it to him that he never going to get the job. The overseas position was promised to me several weeks earlier as a reward for handling an extremely difficult situation for nearly 2 years prior. The company was required to post the position internally per our policy for everyone to see, but they had already made the decision that it was my position if I wanted it. Story 46. My mom was hopeful that my brother was getting his life together, and I quickly had to crush her hopes and tell her my brother was arrested again. That Friday, she gave him money for a down payment on a room rental at a guy's house in town because he was turning things around. Come Monday, he was in jail. I also had to tell her he was addicted to cocaine because I had just cleaned out multiple empty small baggies with white residue after packing up his room that my mom gave him a down payment for. We haven't spoken with him in months now. I hope he's doing okay. His friends bailed him out and he's gone with the wind now. Story 47 was a hiring manager. People always asked if there were openings, and I'd let them know if there were or what they needed to be familiar with in case something came open. Had a girl ask for a job. Told her she wasn't qualified, but offered to meet with her to get her there. She said she was qualified, and I was like, send me your resume and we'll talk. Girl was not qualified, and she argued with me. Red flag, and I just had to tell her, I'm the hiring manager who hires people after reviewing their experience, and I'm telling you you're not qualified, but I'd be happy to discuss what you need to become qualified. Kept interrupting me, so I invited her to apply. She applied 5 times and finally spoke with the people I had hired and finally realized, oh, I really wasn't qualified. Yeah, sweetheart. That only took 5 years. Never did meet with me to see what needed doing to get hired on. Story 48. I was out with my buddy at a karaoke bar. He'd been hyping himself up all week, convinced he was the next big thing in singing. Finally, his big moment came, and he picked Bohemian Rhapsody, the ultimate karaoke flex. He got on stage, lights dimmed, and the music started. He belted out the first few lines with so much confidence, but his voice, it was like a cat stuck in a vacuum cleaner. People started wincing. A few even left. When he came back to the table, still beaming, I had to break it to him. Man, I hate to say this, but I think Freddie Mercury just rolled over in his grave. He laughed at first, thinking I was kidding. But when he saw the bartender giving him free drinks out of pity, it sank in. Story 49. I'm an attorney. A few years ago, I was at a party and randomly I met up with a girl that I went to high school with. She was finishing up a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, although it had taken her several years of stopping/starting/changing majors. She started asking me a ton of questions about working as a lawyer and said that she was interested in pursuing it as a career. I asked her what law school she had applied to or was thinking of attending. She got a very confused look on her face and asked, law school? Apparently, she was somehow not aware that you have to get a JD to practice law and had been thinking she could do it with a 4-year degree. When I explained the process and that it was pretty intense and involved 3 more years of expensive schooling, she got really upset and left the party. Honestly, she's probably better off because this career is ridiculous. Story 50. Not the same as a few of the posts here so far, but a few years ago, my wife and I were taking ferry somewhere. They had a TV on in the cabin showing clips from the previous week in the NFL. The one particular clip they showed was when Rodgers was still in Green Bay and had a particularly bad game throwing multiple interceptions. My wife was watching that clip, and after they moved on to the next clip, my wife loudly says, wow, Brett Favre really needs to hang them up. I just stared at her. She caught my look and goes, that's not Brett Favre, is it? At least she laughed about it. Story 51, I've had 2 recently. One at work where a new associate had some very old school views on how to deal with children, and also saying she didn't agree with what was on child's BIP. I sat down and told her I didn't care how much she didn't like the BIP. It was a legally binding contract, and if she wasn't going to follow it, she should find a new job. The other one was with a woman I was talking with and potentially going to date, but all she did was complain, and it was like nothing was ever good enough. It was soul-sucking. It came to a point where I dreaded looking at my phone and seeing a message from her because I knew it was just going to be more complaining. I stopped responding, and she eventually asked me why. I had to tell her that I felt like she sucked all the happiness out of the day, and I no longer wanted to continue speaking with her. Story 52. I had one that was actually really hard. My brother and sister-in-law had just had a miscarriage and told me to let my parents know they needed some space to themselves at the time. Then when I went to tell my parents, they were talking really excitedly to each other about calling my brother and how they were looking forward to being grandparents and helping out with the baby. Story 53. I had a job in a call center doing cold calls. After about 2 months of getting absolutely no leads, I went to my boss and said this job just isn't for me. He said he'd planned to let me go on the Friday. I asked if he'd consider moving me to another position instead of call center job, and he agreed. I went to data entry and stayed with the company for another 5 years. I'm just glad I got to speak first.